The chandeliers of Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light splintering across crystal and silver, until the entire ballroom seemed to shimmer like something conjured from a fever dream, and Lady Arabella Thornfield stood at the periphery of this glittering spectacle, her gloved hands clasped before her dove-grey gown, watching as the man she had loved in silence for 3 years knelt before her dearest friend. The Duke of Ashworth, tall, devastatingly handsome, with dark hair that fell just so across his aristocratic brow, held Lady Caroline Ashby's hand with the careful formality that characterized everything he did, and his voice, that deep, resonant voice Arabella had memorized from 100 fleeting conversations, carried across the sudden hush of the ballroom as he spoke the words that would seal Arabella's fate. "Lady Caroline, you would do me the greatest honor if you would consent to become my Duchess." The collective intake of breath from 300 members of the ton was like the whisper of silk against marble, and Arabella felt something inside her chest crack with such precision that she marveled no one could hear it, that terrible sound of a heart breaking cleanly in two. She had known this moment was coming, of course had known it from the instant. Caroline had confided 3 weeks prior that the Duke had requested permission to court her, as had known it with the dull certainty of someone watching storm clouds gather on a horizon, inevitable and inexorable. Yet knowing and witnessing proved to be entirely different species of pain. Caroline's face, lovely and serene as a cameo, bloomed with pleasure as she murmured her acceptance, and the ballroom erupted in polite applause, gloved hands creating a sound like gentle rain, while Arabella stood motionless in her shadowed corner, her face arranged in the pleasant expression of vague contentment that she had perfected over 23 years of being overlooked, unremarkable, safely invisible. She thought of the first time she had truly seen him, 3 years ago at the Pemberton ball, how he had laughed at something Lord Hartwick said, his whole face transforming with genuine mirth, and how that laugh had struck her like a physical blow, lodging itself somewhere beneath her ribs, where it had remained ever since, a beautiful ache she had learned to carry. She thought of the garden party at Rosewood, where he had walked past her without seeing her, so absorbed in conversation about estate management that she might as well have been another topiary, and how she had stood there breathing in the scent of roses, and his cologne, sandalwood, and something indefinably masculine, committing it to memory, like a miser hoarding gold. She thought of the charity auction, where their hands had accidentally brushed as they both reached for the same pamphlet, and how he had smiled at her with distant politeness, the smile one gives to any stranger, to anyone who does not matter, before turning away to speak with someone important, someone visible, someone who was not her. Now he was engaged to Caroline, beautiful, vivacious Caroline, who commanded every room she entered, and Arabella understood with the clarity of absolute despair that she would smile through the engagement festivities, would help plan the wedding, would stand as maid of honor and watch him pledge himself to another, because that was what invisible women did. They supported, they facilitated, they made themselves useful in the margins of other people's happiness. The formal announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days later, black ink on cream paper declaring to all of London that His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth, had secured the hand of Lady Caroline Ashby, and would anyone who had ever imagined their name in that position please kindly expire from envy. And Arabella read it over breakfast while her mother chatted about what a splendid match it was, how Caroline had done so well for herself, how the Duke was everything a gentleman should be titled, wealthy, handsome, principled, and wasn't it wonderful that Arabella would be so intimately involved in the wedding preparations, being Caroline's dearest friend and all. Arabella murmured appropriate responses while the toast turned to ash in her mouth, while she remembered the charity musicale 2 years ago when the Duke had stood beside the pianoforte listening to a soprano massacre, a perfectly innocent aria, and Arabella had caught his eye and seen the flicker of shared amusement there, just for an instant, before his attention had been claimed by Lady Hartwick, and Arabella had become invisible again, a ghost haunting the margins of his awareness. She remembered the afternoon at Kew Gardens, when she had been sketching the exotic orchids in the hothouse, and he had walked past deep in conversation about agricultural reform, and she had held her breath, as though by remaining perfectly still, she might preserve the moment of his proximity, might somehow absorb through the warm air between them some essence of him to sustain her through the long drought of his absence. She remembered last Christmas at the Blackwood estate, before the feud had intensified to its current bitter pitch when she had dropped her fan and he had retrieved it, his fingers brushing hers as he returned it, and she had stammered some idiotic thank you while her heart had hammered so loudly. She was certain everyone in the drawing room could hear it, a drumbeat of desperate longing that accompanied her everywhere he was. When Caroline had summoned her that afternoon to her drawing room, radiant with happiness, pulling Arabella into an embrace that smelled of rosewater and joy, Arabella had manufactured a smile from somewhere deep in her reserves of self-preservation and offered congratulations that sounded genuine even to her own ears, had listened to Caroline's breathless recounting of the proposal with appropriate exclamations of delight, had agreed that, yes, the Duke was everything wonderful, yes, Caroline was the luckiest woman in England, yes, of course Arabella would be honored to serve as maid of honor, as though her heart were not actively bleeding out inside her chest, staining everything crimson, while her face remained pleasantly composed. Caroline had noticed nothing, had seen nothing beyond her own happiness, and Arabella could not even resent her for it, because Caroline had never known, had never suspected that her quiet, unremarkable friend harbored feelings for anyone, let alone for the Duke, and Arabella had made certain of that, had guarded her secret with the vigilance of someone protecting something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. That evening, alone in her bedchamber with the curtains drawn against the dying light, Arabella had permitted herself exactly 10 minutes to weep, great wrenching sobs that shook her frame, before she had washed her face, straightened her spine, and made the decision that had governed her existence ever since she would bury this love so deep that even she might forget it was there, would perform her role with such grace that no one would ever guess at the devastation beneath, would be the perfect friend, the perfect maid of honor, the perfect witness to someone else's happiness, because that was all invisible women were ever permitted to be. Viscount Damien Blackwood entered the Pemberton Ball 3 weeks after the Duke's engagement announcement, like a storm front moving across an otherwise placid sky, and the collective response of the assembled company was a frisson of delicious alarm. For Blackwood was everything the Duke was not dangerous, where Ashworth was principled, scandalous, where the Duke was irreproachable, devastatingly handsome in a way that suggested sin rather than salvation, with hair as black as midnight and eyes the color of smoke and secrets. The feud between the Ashworth and Blackwood families stretched back 3 generations to some dispute over land and honor that had calcified into the sort of hatred that becomes almost ritualistic, each slight begetting another until the original cause was lost beneath layers of accumulated grievances, and it was understood by all of society that the Duke and the Viscount were mortal enemies, that they moved through London's social sphere like opposing magnetic forces, repelling each other with such consistency that hostesses often had to choose which man to invite, lest their drawing rooms become battlegrounds. Arabella was standing beside Caroline near the refreshment table, listening to her friend's animated discussion of wedding breakfast menus with Lady Hartwick, when she felt, rather than saw, Blackwood's gaze settle upon her with the weight of deliberate intention, and when she glanced up, startled, she found him watching her with an expression of speculative interest that made her skin prickle with wariness and something else she could not quite name. He crossed the ballroom with the predatory grace of a wolf moving through sheep, ignoring the whispers that followed in his wake, the fans that fluttered with scandalized excitement, the mothers who pulled their daughters closer, as though his reputation for ruination might prove contagious, and he stopped directly before Arabella with a bow that was precisely calibrated to be proper, while somehow suggesting impropriety, his smoke-grey eyes never leaving her face as he requested the honor of an introduction. Caroline had performed the introduction with obvious reluctance, her voice tight with protective concern, and Arabella had offered her hand, feeling as though she had somehow stumbled into a play where everyone knew their lines except her, watching as Blackwood brought her gloved fingers to his lips in a gesture that lasted precisely 1 second longer than propriety dictated, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. Across the ballroom, she had seen the Duke stiffen, had watched his jaw clench and his hand tighten around his champagne glass until she half expected the crystal to shatter, had observed the way his attention locked onto her interaction with Blackwood with the focused fury of a man witnessing a personal affront, and for the first time in 3 years she had felt truly seen by him, even if what he saw was merely a pawn in his ancient rivalry. Blackwood had lingered in conversation, asking about her interests with a politeness that seemed genuine, commenting on a book she had mentioned, seeing her carry the previous week at Hatchard's, which meant he had noticed her, had actually observed her when she thought herself invisible, and Arabella had felt confusion bloom alongside something that might have been anger, because surely this attention was calculated, surely she was simply a convenient instrument through which to wound the Duke. And yet there was something in Blackwood's manner that suggested layers beneath the obvious, depths that belied his reputation as a simple rake and scoundrel. The proposal came 2 days later at Lady Worthington's garden party, under a sky-threatening rain that made the assembled guests cluster beneath the striped silk pavilions like butterflies seeking shelter, and Blackwood found Arabella standing alone near the rose arbor, pretending to admire the late-blooming specimens while actually hiding from the pitying glances of matrons who had begun to whisper about how tragic it was that poor Lady Arabella would likely remain unmarried, a perpetual attendant to other women's happiness. He had approached with that same predatory grace, had stood close enough that propriety dictated she should step back, but she found herself frozen in place, watching as he surveyed her with an expression that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance, as though committing her to memory. And then he had spoken with a directness that stole her breath, saying that he found her company unexpectedly engaging, that he wished to know her better, that he intended to court her properly if she would permit it, and the entire garden seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. Arabella's first instinct had been refusal, had been to protect herself from becoming a mere instrument in his war against the Duke, but as she opened her mouth to decline politely, she caught sight of the Duke across the lawn standing beside Caroline, his attention supposedly on his betrothed, but his gaze locked with laser focus on Arabella and Blackwood, his jaw set in that particular way that indicated barely restrained fury, and something rebellious sparked to life in her chest, something that whispered that perhaps being noticed even as a pawn was better than remaining invisible, that perhaps being the center of attention in a scandal was preferable to being forgotten in virtue. She had accepted Blackwood's proposal with a calm that surprised even herself, had agreed to a dance at the next ball, to a carriage ride in Hyde Park, to whatever public courtship he wished to conduct, and she watched his eyes widen slightly with what might have been surprise or approval, or possibly triumph, though beneath that she thought she detected something else, something that looked almost like genuine pleasure, and the whispers that erupted around them were immediate and vicious and strangely exhilarating. The ton immediately assumed they understood the game being played, that Blackwood was courting Lady Arabella purely to antagonize the Duke, that the quiet wallflower had somehow become the battlefield upon which ancient grievances would be contested, and Arabella found she did not care what they thought, found that after 3 years of careful invisibility, she was stepping into the light, with a recklessness that felt like freedom, or at least like the desperate cousin of freedom, the kind that comes when you believe you have nothing left to lose. That night, lying awake in her chamber while moonlight painted silver squares across the floor, Arabella had examined her decision from every angle, had asked herself whether she was being foolish, whether she was courting heartbreak of an entirely different variety, whether accepting attention from a man reputed to be dangerous and unprincipled was the act of a woman finally claiming agency, or simply the desperate gambit of one who had been overlooked too long, and she found she could not answer, could only acknowledge that for the first time in years she felt something other than resigned melancholy, felt the dangerous flutter of possibility, even if that possibility might destroy her, because at least destruction was a kind of transformation, and invisibility was a kind of death. The Coventry Ball 3 nights later was ablaze with candlelight that transformed the grand ballroom into something between cathedral and theatre, and every eye turned when Viscount Blackwood arrived precisely at the moment the orchestra began tuning their instruments, moving through the crowd with Arabella on his arm, as though he had every right to escort her, as though the shocked whispers and barely concealed gasps of the assembled ton were music accompanying his entrance, and Arabella felt the weight of 1,000 gazes upon her, like physical pressure against her skin, felt herself transformed from invisible wallflower to spectacular scandal in the space of a single evening. The waltz began with the first sweep of violins, and Blackwood led her onto the floor with a hand at her waist that was perfectly proper in placement, yet somehow felt possessive in its certainty, his smoke-grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the crowded ballroom seem to contract, until there was only the two of them, suspended in candlelight and music, spinning through space while society watched with voracious fascination, and Arabella discovered that being the center of attention was both terrifying and intoxicating. That scandal had a flavor like champagne gone to her head, bright and dangerous, and utterly transformative. She could feel the Duke's stare from across the ballroom like heat against her back, could sense without looking the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides, and could imagine the white-knuckled fury in his grip and the thunder in his expression as he watched his mortal enemy waltz with the woman who had stood invisible beside his betrothed for 3 long years. And something wild and reckless bloomed in her chest, something that whispered, "This is what it feels like to be seen, even if the seeing comes wrapped in anger rather than love, even if she is merely the instrument through which old hatreds play their discordant songs." Blackwood danced with the skill of a man who had waltzed through countless ballrooms and considerably more bedrooms, his movements fluid and assured, guiding her through the turns with a grace that made her feel as though she, too, possessed elegance she had never claimed before. And he leaned close enough that propriety frowned but did not quite forbid, murmuring that she looked magnificent when she stopped trying to disappear, that the color in her cheeks and the light in her eyes transformed her into something incandescent, and Arabella felt layers of careful invisibility peeling away like old paint, revealing something raw and vital beneath. From the edge of the dance floor, Caroline watched with concern etched across her delicate features, her hand resting on the Duke's arm in a gesture that was meant to restrain him, and Arabella caught her friend's worried gaze for just a moment before the waltz spun her away, saw the question there and the fear, and felt a stab of guilt that she was causing Caroline distress, even as she could not bring herself to regret this moment of being gloriously, scandalously visible. The whispers rose like tide around them, fans fluttering with the rhythm of gossip, matrons leaning close to one another to share predictions of ruin and speculation about Blackwood's intentions, young ladies watching with expressions caught between envy and horror, and Arabella realized with sudden crystalline clarity that she had spent so long trying to be good and quiet and invisible that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be alive, to feel her own pulse quicken with something other than melancholy, to exist as more than shadow at the edges of other people's happiness. And even if this awakening came through scandal, even if Blackwood's attention was calculated and the Duke's fury was merely wounded pride, she could not bring herself to care, because for the first time in 3 years she felt like a woman with desires and agency rather than a ghost haunting the corners of ballrooms, and that transformation, however it had been sparked, was hers to claim. The garden beyond the ballroom doors beckoned with shadows and silver moonlight, and when the final strains of their waltz faded, Blackwood had guided her through the French doors with a touch so light upon her elbow that she might have imagined it, leading her down stone steps still warm from the day's sun into a world transformed by night into something between dream and sanctuary, where roses released their perfume into air that tasted of approaching autumn, and the distant music from the ballroom seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. They walked in silence at first along gravel paths that crunched softly beneath their feet, past marble statuary that gleamed pale as ghosts in the moonlight, and Arabella found herself waiting for him to speak, to reveal the calculated nature of his attention, to confirm what society already believed about his courtship being merely strategy in his war against the Duke. But instead he remained quiet beside her, with his hands clasped behind his back, his profile etched in silver and shadow as he appeared to study the night sky, as though reading prophecies written in constellations. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost that edge of practiced charm that characterized his public persona, had become something softer and more contemplative, as he said that he had watched her for longer than she knew, had noticed her at gatherings over the past year, standing at the edges of ballrooms with a book of poetry half hidden in her reticule, had observed the way her eyes would track certain conversations with an intelligence that her careful demeanor tried to conceal, had recognized in her the particular loneliness of someone who possessed depths that no one bothered to explore, and his words struck her with the force of revelation, because they suggested he had seen her even when she believed herself invisible, and had noticed her before the Duke's engagement had made her a useful pawn in ancient rivalries. Arabella stopped walking and turned to face him, the moonlight painting half his face in silver while leaving the other half in shadow, and she asked with a directness that surprised them both whether any part of his interest was genuine or whether she was simply a convenient instrument for causing the Duke pain. And she watched something flicker across his expression that looked almost like hurt before he answered. That perhaps it had begun as strategy, but had become something else entirely when she accepted his proposal with that combination of recklessness and resignation, when she had looked at him with eyes that suggested she was choosing to burn rather than fade, and he found himself genuinely wanting to know what fires burned beneath her careful composure, what passions she had taught herself to suppress in service of remaining acceptably invisible. He moved closer then, not touching but near enough that she could smell the sandalwood of his cologne and see the way the moonlight caught the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, and he told her that she possessed the kind of intelligence that most men would find threatening, that she had clearly read philosophy and poetry beyond what was considered appropriate for young ladies, that he had heard her quote Marcus Aurelius under her breath at Lady Pemberton's dinner party, when the conversation had turned tedious, and he alone had been positioned to notice, and Arabella felt something crack in her chest at being so thoroughly seen, at having someone catalogue not her deficiencies, but rather the parts of herself she had learned to hide, because they made her unsuitable for the role of decorative wife that society demanded. She found herself confessing things she had never spoken aloud, found herself describing the suffocation of always performing appropriate feminine restraint, the exhaustion of pretending her mind did not race ahead of conversations to conclusions no one wanted to hear, the particular pain of loving a man who looked through her as though she were made of glass. And Blackwood listened with an attention so complete it felt like being held, and when she finally fell silent, he said that perhaps they were both tired of pretending to be less than they were, that perhaps there was freedom in choosing to be seen fully, even if that seeing came through scandal, and Arabella realized with dawning wonder and terror that her defenses against him were crumbling not because of calculated seduction, but because he was offering her something she had never expected to find, the dangerous gift of genuine recognition, and she understood with sudden clarity that the complexity of her situation had deepened beyond anything she had imagined, that she stood now at a crossroads where every choice would transform her, and there was no path back to the safe invisibility she had occupied before. The musicale at Lady Pemberton's townhouse 4 evenings later was meant to be an intimate affair, chamber music, performed by accomplished young ladies while society's elite sipped champagne and pretended to appreciate Vivaldi. But the Duke of Ashworth had arrived with thunder in his expression, and Caroline on his arm looking increasingly concerned, and he had positioned himself near the refreshment table with a vantage point that allowed him to track Arabella's every movement through the crowded drawing room, his jaw set with such tension that Caroline had whispered something that might have been meant to soothe him, but only made his scowl deepen. Arabella had arrived with her mother as chaperone, carefully not looking toward where the Duke stood radiating barely contained fury, and she had taken her seat for the performance with what she hoped was serene composure, even as her pulse hammered against her throat. But during the interval between pieces, he had crossed the room with such purposeful strides that conversations died in his wake, and before she could rise or retreat, he was there beside her, his voice low and tight as he requested a private word in tones that made it clear this was demand rather than request. The small library off the main drawing room smelled of leather and old paper, and the Duke closed the door behind them with a control that suggested he was fighting the urge to slam it, and when he turned to face her, his blue eyes were stormy with emotions she had never seen directed at her before, bright with something that looked almost like anguish beneath the anger, and he demanded without preamble what she thought she was doing with Blackwood, whether she had any understanding of the man's reputation, whether she truly believed herself equipped to navigate the dangerous waters of his attention. Arabella felt something cold settle in her chest at his tone, at the way he spoke to her, as though she were a foolish child, playing with matches rather than a woman of 24 who had spent 3 years watching him court and become engaged to her best friend, and she said with a calmness that belied the trembling in her hands that she was quite capable of managing her own affairs, that Lord Blackwood had been nothing but respectful in his attentions, that she failed to see how her courtship concerned his grace, given that he was betrothed to another. The Duke's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white with pressure. and he said that Blackwood would ruin her, that the man's interest was clearly calculated to wound him through harming someone under his protection, and Arabella felt something snap inside her at those words, at his presumption that she was merely an object through which men played their games of rivalry. And she asked with quiet steel in her voice, when precisely she had come under his protection, whether he had noticed her existence at all before Blackwood had looked at her with genuine interest, whether his concern was truly for her reputation or merely for his own pride at seeing his enemy pay attention to someone he had never bothered to see. The Duke stared at her as though she had struck him, his expression shifting through surprise and confusion to something that looked almost like pain, and he opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, and Arabella watched him struggle with emotions he clearly did not understand, saw the way his certainty crumbled beneath her quiet accusations, and she realized with startling clarity that he genuinely could not articulate why her courtship with Blackwood affected him so profoundly, that his fury exceeded what protective friendship should inspire, and the first dangerous seed of possibility planted itself in her heart, even as she crushed it ruthlessly beneath the weight of 3 years' worth of unrequited longing and the memory of watching him propose to Caroline while she stood invisible at the ballroom's edge. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of transformation, each day marked by encounters that would have seemed impossible in Arabella's former life of careful invisibility, and she found herself awakening each morning with a sense of anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying as she prepared for yet another outing with Lord Blackwood, another afternoon where she would be seen and noticed and drawn into conversations that challenged her mind rather than simply requiring polite acquiescence. They drove through Hyde Park during the fashionable hour in his elegant barouche, and while society watched with hungry eyes cataloguing every gesture between them, he asked her opinion on the new translation of Homer that had caused such controversy in literary circles, and she found herself discussing dactylic hexameter and the challenges of rendering ancient Greek into English, while other young ladies simpered and discussed nothing more substantial than the weather, and the freedom of intellectual engagement felt like breathing clean air after years of suffocation. He took her to poetry readings in intimate salons where radical thinkers gathered to discuss Byron and Shelley, and though her mother accompanied them as propriety demanded, Blackwood ensured that Arabella was introduced as someone whose opinions mattered, whose insights were worth hearing, and she discovered a version of herself that had existed only in private imagination, the woman who could debate metaphor and meaning without apologizing for the depth of her thoughts. There were carriage rides through the countryside beyond London, where autumn was beginning to paint the landscape in amber and crimson, and during these quieter moments away from society's scrutinizing gaze, they talked of deeper things, of the masks people wore to survive the demands of their world, of the particular loneliness of being misunderstood or unseen, and Arabella realized that beneath his reputation as a rake and scoundrel, Blackwood possessed his own carefully concealed wounds, his own history of being reduced to caricature rather than recognized as fully human. The ton's gossip intensified with each passing week, whispers following Arabella wherever she went about the scandalous nature of her courtship, speculation about whether Blackwood's intentions were honorable or if she was merely a pawn in his vendetta against the Duke. But she found that she cared less about their judgment than she would have imagined possible, that there was a strange power in being talked about rather than overlooked, and she was becoming someone new in the crucible of their attention, someone who walked with her head high and met curious gazes with calm assurance rather than apologetic diffidence. Through it all, Caroline's wedding preparations continued with relentless momentum, and Arabella fulfilled her duties as maid of honor with what appeared to be gracious dedication, attending fittings for her bridesmaid gown in pale rose silk, offering opinions on floral arrangements and menu selections, listening to Caroline's excited plans for the wedding breakfast while something twisted painfully in her chest. Because even as she was being transformed by Blackwood's courtship, even as she was discovering new versions of herself, the underlying reality remained unchanged, that in 6 weeks, the man she had loved in silence for 3 years would marry her dearest friend, would pledge himself to Caroline in a ceremony where Arabella would stand witness to the death of dreams she had never dared speak aloud, and she understood with aching clarity that transformation did not erase pain, but rather made it more complex, layering new emotions over old wounds until she could no longer distinguish between the healing and the hurting. The Duke of Ashworth found himself unable to concentrate on the simplest matters as October deepened and his wedding drew closer with each passing day, and he would sit in meetings with his steward discussing tenant concerns, only to realize he had absorbed nothing of the conversation because his mind was occupied with images of Arabella laughing at something Blackwood had said, her face transformed by genuine joy in a way he could not recall ever witnessing during all the years she had hovered at the edges of ballrooms while he danced with more celebrated beauties. Caroline would ask his opinion on some detail of the wedding breakfast menu, and he would respond with whatever seemed appropriate, but his thoughts were elsewhere, tracking the hours until he might encounter Arabella at some evening entertainment, and catalogue the changes in her that seemed to multiply with each passing week. The way she held herself with new confidence, the spark of intellectual engagement that lit her eyes when Blackwood drew her into conversation about literature or philosophy, and he found himself consumed by questions about what they discussed during their long carriage rides, what made her smile with such unguarded pleasure, what depths existed in her that he had somehow failed to perceive despite 3 years of proximity. He began arriving early to social events, with the sole purpose of observing Arabella's interactions with Blackwood, positioning himself where he could watch them without appearing obvious about his scrutiny, and he told himself this vigilance stemmed from concern for her welfare, given Blackwood's dangerous reputation. But there was a hollowness to this rationalization that echoed in his chest whenever he examined it too closely, a recognition that his emotions exceeded what protective friendship should inspire and ventured into territory that made him profoundly uncomfortable, given that he was betrothed to another woman and had no right to feel this consuming interest in anyone beyond his intended bride. The pivotal moment came at the Duchess of Marlborough's garden party on a crisp afternoon when autumn had painted the carefully manicured grounds in shades of amber and gold, and the Duke stood near the ornamental fountain, making polite conversation with several gentlemen about matters of no importance, while his attention remained fixed on where Arabella sat beneath a copper beech tree with Blackwood beside her, and he watched as Blackwood said something that made her throw her head back with laughter, completely unguarded and radiant with genuine happiness, and the Duke realized with dawning horror that he had never seen her truly happy before this moment, that in 3 years of acquaintance he had never witnessed this particular quality of joy in her expression, had never heard her laugh with such unrestrained delight, and the recognition struck him like a physical blow that he had somehow managed to know her and not know her at all, had seen her hundreds of times without truly seeing her, had reduced her to a pleasant blur of propriety and quiet service to Caroline, rather than recognizing her as a woman of depth and complexity who possessed the capacity for this transformative joy that now illuminated her features as she engaged with his mortal enemy. The remainder of the garden party passed in a fog of mounting panic as he grappled with implications he was not yet ready to name, as he forced himself through the motions of attending to Caroline, while his mind spun through memories of Arabella standing silent at ballroom edges, serving tea with gentle competence, offering congratulations on his engagement with a smile that he now recognized had never reached her eyes, and he felt the foundations of his carefully constructed life beginning to shift beneath his feet. Even as his wedding loomed just 6 weeks distant and honor demanded, he maintained his course toward a future that was suddenly, terrifyingly wrong in ways he could not yet articulate, but felt with devastating certainty. Caroline arrived at the Thornfield townhouse on a grey afternoon, when rain streaked the windows and turned the London streets to mud, and she found Arabella in the morning room pretending to read a novel, though the pages had not turned in over an hour, and there was something in Caroline's expression that suggested this visit bore purpose beyond the casual friendliness that had characterized their years of companionship, a gravity in her blue eyes that made Arabella set aside her book with careful deliberation, while anxiety tightened in her chest. "We must speak honestly, you and I," Caroline said quietly as she settled into the chair across from Arabella, waving away the tea that was offered, her hands folding in her lap with uncharacteristic tension, and Arabella felt the careful scaffolding of pretense she had maintained begin to tremble, because she recognized this tone, this particular quality of gentle determination that meant Caroline would not be deflected by polite evasions or cheerful misdirection. "I have noticed certain things these past weeks, Bella, and I find I cannot in good conscience remain silent when silence might cause harm to someone I hold dear." The words hung between them like crystal poised to shatter, and Arabella forced herself to maintain composure, even as panic rose in her throat, because she understood with awful clarity where this conversation must lead. What observations Caroline must have made during all those hours of wedding planning, when Arabella's smiles had grown increasingly brittle, and the Duke's attention had wandered to places it should not venture. "The Duke has been behaving most strangely," Caroline continued, her voice careful and measured as though she were navigating treacherous terrain, testing each word before giving it weight. "He is distracted during our conversations, agitated whenever Lord Blackwood's name is mentioned, and I have caught him watching you with an intensity that exceeds what brotherly concern might excuse." She paused, studying Arabella's face with an attention that felt unbearable, and then added with devastating gentleness, "And you, my dearest friend, have transformed these past weeks in ways that speak of profound change. Though whether that change brings you joy or pain, I find myself unable to determine, for you have become remarkably skilled at concealing your true feelings, and I wonder when that particular talent developed and what necessity required its cultivation." Arabella opened her mouth to offer some reassurance, some carefully constructed explanation that would preserve the fiction of normalcy, but Caroline raised a hand to forestall her, and there was such compassion in that gesture that it nearly undid all of Arabella's carefully maintained control. "Please do not insult me with denials or protestations that all is well, for we have been friends too long for me not to recognize when you are suffering, even when you smile and claim contentment," Caroline said, and then she leaned forward, her eyes searching Arabella's face with uncomfortable perception. "I must ask you something, and I require your honesty, even if the truth proves difficult to speak. Do you have feelings for the Duke? Have you perhaps harbored affections for him that you felt unable to express?" The question landed like a stone thrown through glass, and Arabella felt all her defenses crack under the weight of Caroline's directness, felt 3 years of silent longing rise up in her throat, demanding acknowledgement, but still she hesitated, because to admit the truth would be to fundamentally alter her friendship with Caroline, would be to confess a betrayal, even if that betrayal had existed only in the private chambers of her heart and had never manifested in action or interference. Yet Caroline's eyes held such understanding, such absence of judgment, that Arabella found herself whispering, "Yes, for longer than I care to admit, though I swear to you I never intended to act upon those feelings, never sought to come between you, and my acceptance of Lord Blackwood's attentions was born of desperation to find some way forward that did not require me to stand witness to your wedding while my heart broke in silence." Caroline absorbed this confession, without apparent surprise, and then she did something Arabella had not anticipated, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to take Arabella's trembling hands in her own steady grasp, and when she spoke, her voice carried a revelation of equal weight. "I accepted the Duke's proposal because it was advantageous, because he is kind and honorable, and our union makes sense in all the practical ways that society values. But I have never loved him with passion or felt my heart race at his approach, and I wonder if perhaps we have all been proceeding toward a wedding that serves convention rather than happiness, that binds two people in obligation while allowing true feeling to wither unexpressed, and I find I can no longer participate in such a charade without at least acknowledging the possibility that we might all be making a terrible mistake." The Countess of Pemberton's annual autumn ball was the most anticipated event of the season, held in a magnificent ballroom where crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across marble floors, and the cream of society gathered in their finest attire. And it was here, amid the swirl of silk and the murmur of 500 voices, that the carefully maintained pretense of civility finally shattered beyond repair, when Lord Blackwood arrived with Arabella on his arm and led her directly to the center of the room, where visibility was unavoidable and all eyes could witness what happened next. The orchestra had just concluded a quadrille when Blackwood raised his voice with deliberate projection, addressing Arabella with words clearly intended for the assembled company to hear, declaring that he wished to make known his most serious intentions toward Lady Arabella Thornfield, that his regard for her transcended mere courtship and extended to a desire for permanent union, and that he intended to approach her father on the morrow to formally request permission to seek her hand in marriage, and the ballroom fell into stunned silence as society absorbed this shocking announcement. For while Blackwood's attentions to Arabella had been noted and gossiped about extensively, no one had truly expected the notorious rake to declare himself so publicly or to attach his notorious name to a respectable woman in such an irrevocable fashion. Arabella felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing against her like a physical force, felt her cheeks flame with a mixture of mortification and something else she could not quite name. But before she could formulate any response to Blackwood's declaration, a commotion erupted near the refreshment tables where the Duke of Ashworth had been standing with Caroline, and suddenly he was striding across the ballroom floor, with his face contorted by fury and his hands clenched into fists, and when he reached them he seized Blackwood by the lapels of his evening coat and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "You will retract that statement immediately and remove yourself from Lady Arabella's presence, or by God I will call you out and settle this matter as our fathers should have settled it a generation ago," the Duke growled, and there was such raw aggression in his demeanor that several gentlemen moved forward to intervene, but Blackwood merely smiled with cold amusement and replied that the Duke had no authority to dictate whom Arabella might choose to accept, that his own engagement to Lady Caroline precluded any legitimate concern beyond general friendship, and that his violent reaction revealed more about his own conflicted feelings than it did about any supposed impropriety in Blackwood's courtship. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Arabella saw the Duke's face pale, even as his grip on Blackwood tightened, saw the moment when propriety warred with passion and lost, and she knew with terrible clarity that if she did not intervene immediately, these two men would indeed meet at dawn, with pistols drawn, and her name would be the cause of bloodshed. So she stepped between them with a composure she did not feel, and spoke with quiet authority that somehow cut through the tension, saying that she would thank both gentlemen to remember that she possessed agency over her own life and decisions, that she was not a prize to be fought over or a pawn in their ancient rivalry, and that if they wished to demonstrate their regard for her, they might begin by treating her as a rational being capable of making her own choices rather than as an object whose fate must be determined by masculine posturing and threats of violence. The Duke released Blackwood abruptly as though burned, staring at Arabella with an expression of such anguished confusion that she nearly softened, but she held her ground while the entire ballroom watched with rapt attention, and in that moment she understood that whatever privacy or anonymity she had once possessed was forever shattered, that she had become the central figure in a scandal that would fuel society gossip for months to come, and that the choice she made in the coming days would determine not only her own future, but the fates of all three people caught in this impossible triangle. And the weight of that knowledge settled over her shoulders like a mantle she had never sought but could no longer avoid wearing. Lord Blackwood requested Arabella's presence at his Mayfair residence 2 days after the disastrous ball, and though propriety demanded she refuse such an improper invitation, she found herself accepting because the chaos of recent events had stripped away her concern for convention, and she desperately needed clarity about his true intentions, about whether the man who had awakened her from years of silent invisibility had done so from genuine feeling or merely as an elaborate weapon in his war against the Duke. And when she arrived at his elegantly appointed study, with its walls of leather-bound books and windows overlooking a carefully tended garden, she found him standing with his back to her, his shoulders tense with uncharacteristic vulnerability, and when he finally turned to face her, there was something in his dark eyes she had never seen before, something raw and unguarded that made her breath catch in her throat. "I must tell you the truth, Arabella, even knowing it may destroy whatever regard you have developed for me," he began, his voice rough with emotion as he crossed to stand before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of experiences she could only imagine, and then he continued with devastating honesty. "When I first approached you at that ball months ago, my intentions were entirely calculated, born of a desire to wound the Duke in the most effective manner possible, for I knew he held some measure of protective feeling toward you as his betrothed's dearest friend, and I thought to use his enemy's attention to you as a blade to twist in an old wound, to remind him that everything he values might be touched and tainted by the Blackwood name." The confession struck her like a physical blow, even though some part of her had always suspected this truth. had recognized the too perfect timing of his interest, the way his attentions had seemed designed to provoke maximum reaction from the Duke, but hearing him speak it aloud still hurt in ways she had not fully anticipated, and she felt her defenses rising even as he raised his hand in a gesture that begged her patience. But I must also tell you that somewhere in the midst of our conversations, our rides through Hyde Park, our debates about poetry and philosophy and the nature of happiness, something shifted within me, and I found myself drawn to you, not as a means to an end, but as a revelation of what I had been missing in all my years of cynical pursuit, of pleasure and revenge, Blackwood said, and now he reached for her hands, his touch gentle and trembling in a way that contradicted his notorious reputation for cold calculation. You possess an intelligence that challenges me, a quiet strength that shames my own performative bravado, and a capacity for growth and transformation that has forced me to examine my own stagnant existence. And I have fallen in love with you, Arabella, genuinely and completely, though I recognize I have no right to expect you to believe me or to forgive the duplicity of my initial approach. She stood frozen, torn between the instinct to flee this admission and the treacherous hope that perhaps his feelings were sincere, that perhaps she had not been merely a pawn but had somehow become something more. And as she searched his face for signs of deception, she realized with startling clarity that her own feelings had evolved as well, that the woman she had become through their courtship was someone who no longer pined hopelessly for a duke who had never truly seen her, but rather someone who had discovered her own capacity for passion and demand for genuine regard, and she found herself asking the question that would determine everything. If the Duke were to declare for me tomorrow, if he were to break his engagement and offer me everything I once dreamed of having, would you step aside and let me go? The Duke of Ashworth stood in his study at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, unable to sleep for the third consecutive night, staring at the formal wedding invitation that bore his name and Caroline's in elegant script, and announced a ceremony scheduled for 3 weeks hence. And as rain lashed against the windows with autumn fury, he felt the foundations of his carefully ordered life crumbling beneath the weight of a recognition he could no longer deny, and the devastating awareness that he had fallen utterly and irrevocably in love with Arabella Thornfield at precisely the moment when honor and duty made such love an impossible torment. The realization had been building for weeks, accumulating through dozens of small observations that he had tried desperately to dismiss as mere concern for Caroline's friend, but tonight it had crystallized into undeniable truth when he had seen Arabella at the theater with Blackwood, her face luminous with genuine laughter as she debated some point of dramatic interpretation, and he had understood with shattering clarity that he had never truly seen her before, had taken her quiet presence for granted for 3 entire years while she had been standing just beyond his notice, a woman of extraordinary depth and intelligence and passionate feeling that he had been too blind and arrogant to recognize. How had he missed the subtle intelligence in her observations at dinner parties, the dry wit that occasionally surfaced in her comments, the way her eyes reflected profound thought even when she remained silent in company? He remembered now, with aching regret, a garden party 2 summers past when she had been reading Wordsworth beneath an oak tree, and he had walked past without even greeting her, so focused on joining Caroline and her circle of vivacious friends that he had dismissed Arabella as merely part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the flowers bordering the path, and the memory of his own casual blindness made him want to shatter something against the study walls. He had spent the past week attempting to engineer private conversations with her, sending notes requesting her presence at tea, positioning himself at events where he knew she would appear, but Arabella had evaded him with a skill that suggested deliberate avoidance, and each failed attempt only intensified his desperate need to speak with her and to somehow convey the magnitude of his belated recognition, even though he knew such a confession would be unconscionable given his engagement to her dearest friend. The honor that had always been his guiding principle now felt like a cage, trapping him in a commitment made to a woman he respected and admired, but did not love with the consuming passion that now tormented him whenever he thought of Arabella, and he found himself caught between 2 impossible choices, proceeding with a marriage that would condemn him to a lifetime of wondering what might have been, or breaking his word to Caroline in a manner that would destroy her reputation and mark him as a man without integrity, and the internal battle consumed him during every waking hour and haunted his few moments of troubled sleep. He had tried to convince himself that what he felt was merely the foolish attraction of wanting what he could not have, that Blackwood's pursuit of Arabella had simply awakened some primitive competitive instinct, but he knew in his bones that this rationalization was a coward's lie, that what he felt when he watched Arabella had nothing to do with Blackwood and everything to do with the woman herself, with the grace of her gestures and the depths of her thoughts and the quiet strength she had always possessed, but which he had been too obtuse to value until another man had recognized her worth. The wedding loomed before him like an execution date, and with each passing day he felt more certain that he was about to make the greatest mistake of his life. Yet he could see no honorable path forward that did not require either betraying Caroline or condemning himself to eternal regret. And as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky beyond his rain-streaked windows, he remained standing in his study with Arabella's name on his lips, like a prayer for which there could be no answer. The Duke found his opportunity at Lady Pemberton's masquerade ball 2 weeks before his wedding, when he spotted Arabella slipping away from the crowded ballroom toward the quieter corridors of the East Wing, and he followed her with single-minded determination, his heart pounding with the desperate need to finally speak the truth that had been consuming him. And when she entered the library seeking a moment of solitude, he was mere steps behind her, closing the heavy oak door with a decisive click that made her turn sharply to face him with widening eyes. "Your Grace, this is most improper," she said, her voice carefully controlled even as color rose in her cheeks, and he noticed how the candlelight caught the gold threads in her amber gown, how her mask emphasized the delicate curve of her jaw, details he had failed to notice for 3 interminable years, and the waste of it, the sheer criminal waste of all that time he had squandered, threatened to choke him. "I know, and I no longer care about propriety or convention or anything beyond making you understand what I have only recently come to realize," he said, crossing the Persian carpet that separated them until he stood close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to her skin, and he watched her chin lift with the quiet dignity that had always been part of her character, but which he had never truly appreciated until Blackwood had taught him to see. "I am in love with you, Arabella, wholly and irrevocably, and I cannot marry Caroline knowing that my heart belongs entirely to you, knowing that I would spend every day of our marriage wishing I had been brave enough to speak this truth." She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable behind her silver mask, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a steel he had never heard from her before, the voice of a woman who had been transformed through suffering into someone who would no longer accept crumbs when she deserved a feast. "Where was this passion when I stood beside you at garden parties for 3 years, Your Grace? Where was this overwhelming love when I was Caroline's quiet friend? The wallflower you looked past as though I were part of the furniture, unremarkable and unworthy of your notice." The words struck him like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy against the armor of his belated recognition, and he felt shame burn through him as she continued, her hands trembling slightly but her voice growing stronger with each accusation. "You only see me now because Lord Blackwood looked at me first, because another man recognized value where you saw nothing, and I will not accept a love born of jealousy and competitive pride rather than genuine regard. I will not settle for being wanted simply because someone else wants me, after years of being invisible to the very eyes that now claim to see me so clearly." He reached for her hands, desperate to convey the sincerity of his transformation, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them like a barrier he had no right to cross. "That is not why I love you," he insisted, hearing the desperation in his own voice and hating it even as he continued. "Blackwood made me look, yes, but what I saw when I finally looked properly was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and quiet strength, someone whose depths I had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize, and I would give anything to undo those wasted years, to have seen you from the beginning as you deserved to be seen." She removed her mask then, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes, even as her expression remained resolute, and she delivered the truth that would haunt him through all the desperate days to come. "But you did not see me, Your Grace, and that is a fact that cannot be altered by belated declarations or convenient revelations, and I am no longer the woman who would have accepted your notice as the answer to her every prayer, for I have learned through pain and awakening that I deserve to be someone's first choice, not their desperate consolation when honor conflicts with newfound desire." Caroline stood in the shadowed alcove just beyond the library door, her hand pressed against her heart as she listened to the confrontation between the two people she cared for most in this world. And though she had not intended to eavesdrop, the raw emotion in their voices had frozen her in place, and now she understood with crystalline clarity what she had suspected for months, but had been too kind, or perhaps too cowardly, to acknowledge directly. That Arabella had loved the Duke long before his proposal had ever been offered, and that the Duke himself had been blind to a treasure that had stood before him in patient silence until another man had forced him to open his eyes. She waited until Arabella fled the library with tears streaming down her face, waited until her friend had disappeared into the crowded ballroom before she entered the room where the Duke stood, with his head bowed and his hands braced against the mantelpiece, as though the weight of his realization might crush him entirely. And when he turned at the sound of the door closing and saw her standing there, his face went pale with the knowledge that she had heard everything, every desperate declaration and every devastating rejection. "Caroline, he began, but she raised her hand gently to stop him, crossing the library with the same quiet grace that had always characterized her movements, and when she stood before him, she felt no anger or betrayal, only a profound sadness for all of them, for the tangle they had created through well-intentioned blindness and unspoken truths. "I have known about Arabella's feelings for you since the first season we were all in London together," she said softly, watching understanding dawn in his eyes along with fresh shame. "I saw how she looked at you when she thought no one was watching, saw how she would position herself just close enough to hear your conversations without ever intruding upon them, and I told myself that her affection would fade with time, that she would find someone else who could return her regard. But instead, I watched her love deepen and mature into something constant and true, while you remained oblivious to her very existence, beyond her utility as my companion." The Duke's expression was anguished, and she felt a rush of compassion for him despite everything, for she knew him to be a good man who had simply failed to look beyond the surface of social conventions and expected arrangements. "I accepted your proposal because it was an excellent match by every practical measure," she continued, her voice steady even as her heart ached for the friendship that would be forever altered by this confession. "And because I believed that affection and respect were sufficient foundations for a marriage, that passionate love was a luxury reserved for novels and poetry rather than real life. But watching you these past weeks has taught me that I was wrong, that both you and Arabella deserve the kind of love that consumes and transforms, and I will not be the obstacle that prevents either of you from finding it." She saw hope flicker in his eyes and moved quickly to temper it with reality. "I release you from our engagement, Your Grace, freely and without reservation, but you must understand that this does not guarantee Arabella's acceptance of your suit, for you have wounded her deeply through years of neglect, and she has been awakened to her own worth in a manner that makes her unlikely to settle for love, born of belated recognition rather than long-standing devotion." She stepped closer, placing her hand briefly on his arm with genuine affection. "If you truly love her, you must earn her trust through patience and humility. You must prove that you see her, not because Blackwood forced you to look, but because you have finally learned to truly see. And it may take months or even years for her to believe in the sincerity of your transformation, but if your love is genuine, then surely it is worth whatever time and effort such proving requires." The news of the broken engagement reached Arabella through a carefully worded letter from Caroline, delivered to her London townhouse the morning after the masquerade ball, and she sat in her morning room, with the paper trembling in her hands as she read of her friend's sacrifice, of the Duke's freedom, of the impossible choice that now lay before her like a chasm she could not see across. And within hours she had made arrangements to retreat to Thornfield Manor, her family's country estate in Derbyshire, claiming a need to attend to her ailing grandmother, though everyone who mattered understood she was fleeing the impossible tangle her life had become. The autumn countryside welcomed her with golden light and the scent of dying leaves, and for the first weeks she did little beyond walk the familiar paths of her childhood and through orchards heavy with apples waiting to be harvested, and along the river where she had once imagined futures that bore no resemblance to the complicated present in which she now found herself, and she wrestled with questions that had no easy answers, examining her heart with a ruthlessness born of necessity. Both men had written to her, the Duke's letters filled with humble contrition and patient declarations of devotion. Blackwood's correspondence marked by an elegant melancholy and genuine affection that made her heart ache for the connection they had shared, and she read their words in the library where her father's books had first taught her that women could want more than society deemed appropriate, and she began to understand that the choice before her was not really about choosing between two men, but rather about choosing who she had become through the crucible of this entire season. She remembered the girl who had stood at the periphery of ballrooms, content to be invisible if it meant remaining close to a man who never saw her, and she contrasted that shadow self with the woman who now walked these gardens with her head held high, who had learned through Blackwood's attention that she possessed depths worthy of exploration, and through the Duke's belated recognition that she deserved to be someone's first choice rather than their convenient arrangement. Or desperate consolation. The Duke's love, she knew, was genuine now, born of true recognition, even if it had required another man's interest to open his eyes. And there was something in his letters that spoke of transformation, of a man who had learned to see beyond surfaces and conventions to the person beneath. Yet she could not escape the painful truth that he had needed her to be desired by another before he could desire her himself. And that foundation felt precarious, built on jealousy's shifting sands rather than the solid ground of long-standing devotion. Blackwood's love had been awakening and revelation, passion ignited through genuine connection, but she understood now that he had awakened her for herself rather than for him, had taught her to recognize her own worth, even as his initial motivations had been tainted by revenge, and while she cared for him deeply, she sensed that their story had always been meant to be a chapter rather than the full volume of her life. As October gave way to November, and the first frost touched the gardens with crystalline beauty, Arabella came to understand that she could choose neither man until she had first chosen herself, had claimed the transformation they had both facilitated, but which belonged entirely to her own courage and growth, and she wrote letters to both of them, explaining that she would return to London for the little season, but that she required time to understand her own heart before she could offer it to anyone else, and in that patient claiming of her own agency, she discovered the strength that would define all her choices to come. Arabella returned to London in late November, when the little season brought a quieter but no less discerning society back to the city, and those who saw her alight from her carriage at her family's townhouse remarked that something fundamental had shifted in Lady Arabella Thornfield, for she no longer moved with the apologetic hesitation of one trying to occupy as little space as possible, but rather with the assured grace of a woman who had learned her own worth through solitude and honest self-examination, and within days of her arrival she had sent notes to both the Duke and Lord Blackwood requesting private meetings, determined to face the choice before her with the clarity she had earned through weeks of contemplation in Derbyshire's autumn gardens. She met with Blackwood first, receiving him in her family's drawing room on a grey afternoon when rain streaked the windows and turned the city into watercolour washes of movement and light, and when he entered she saw in his eyes both hope and resignation, as though he had already guessed the substance of what she would say, but loved her enough to hear it spoken with his own ears nonetheless. "You awakened something in me that had been sleeping," she told him, her voice steady and kind as she stood by the window watching the rain, "and I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life for teaching me that I deserve to be seen, to be desired, to be chosen with full awareness and intention, rather than convenient arrangement or belated recognition." And she turned to face him then, seeing the way he held himself with careful dignity despite the pain in his expression. "But we both know that what we shared was transformation rather than destination, a passion born of rebellion and discovery, rather than the kind of deep compatibility that sustains a lifetime of partnership," she continued. Crossing to where he stood and taking his hand briefly in hers with genuine affection, "You awakened me for myself, Damien, and perhaps even more significantly, you awakened me for him, and for the Duke, who needed to learn to truly see before he could be worthy of being seen in return." Blackwood's smile was melancholy but genuine, as he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture of farewell that held more grace than bitterness, and he told her that he had known from the moment he first made her laugh that he was teaching her to shine for someone else, and that loving her had been worth the inevitable pain of letting her go. And when he left, she stood alone in the drawing room, feeling both sadness and peace, knowing she had honored what they had shared while being honest about its limitations. The Duke came to her the following evening, and she received him in the same drawing room, though the rain had cleared, and stars now pierced the darkness beyond the windows, and she saw immediately that the weeks since their confrontation in the library had marked him as profoundly as her time in the country had marked her, for there was a humility in his bearing that spoke of genuine transformation rather than temporary chastening. And when he began to speak, she raised her hand to stop him, needing to say what she had rehearsed in her heart before his words could sway her resolve. "If I am to consider your suit," she said quietly, her eyes holding his with unflinching honesty, "you must understand that I will not be the woman who waits patiently in the shadows, hoping for scraps of your attention. Nor will I be the prize you won through jealousy's motivation, for I have learned that I deserve to be someone's first and constant choice, to be seen completely and loved accordingly, and any courtship between us must be built on that foundation, or it will crumble beneath the weight of my own self-knowledge." She saw tears glisten in his eyes as he nodded, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, as he told her that he understood, that he would spend however long it took proving that he had learned to truly see her, and that she was worth every moment of patient courtship and humble demonstration. And in that moment of mutual understanding, Arabella felt the first fragile stirring of hope that perhaps, given time and genuine effort, they might build something real and lasting from the ashes of what had been lost. The Duke's courtship of Arabella unfolded across the winter months, with a patience and intentionality that spoke of fundamental transformation, for he arrived at her townhouse each Tuesday and Friday afternoon precisely at 3 o'clock, bearing not flowers or jewels but rather books he thought she might enjoy, volumes of poetry and philosophy and natural history that demonstrated he had listened to her observations about the world and remembered what sparked light in her eyes, and they would sit in her family's drawing room with her mother as chaperone and discuss ideas with the kind of intellectual equality that Arabella had never imagined possible with a man of his station, their conversations ranging from the reform movements sweeping through Parliament to the Gothic novels she confessed to reading in secret, to theories about the natural world that she had previously kept hidden for fear of seeming unladylike. He attended the same charity events she favored, not the glittering balls where he had once held court, but rather the smaller gatherings organized to raise funds for orphanages and schools for the poor, and he listened as she spoke passionately about the need for education reform and the rights of those society deemed beneath notice. And rather than patronizing her concerns, he engaged with them seriously, asking thoughtful questions and later making substantial donations to the causes she championed, ensuring the credit went to her vision rather than his wealth. At a musicale in January where Arabella had been asked to play the pianoforte, something she had always done competently but without particular distinction, the Duke sat in the front row and watched her with such complete attention that she felt seen in a way that made her fingers move across the keys with newfound confidence, and afterward he told her not that she played beautifully as men often did when they meant nothing by it, but rather that he could hear in her interpretation of the sonata the same contemplative depth he had come to recognize in her conversation, and that her music revealed the interior landscape of a soul he was only beginning to understand and hoped to spend a lifetime exploring. When society gossips whispered that Lady Arabella Thornfield had brought the Duke of Ashworth to heel, he corrected them publicly at a dinner party, stating clearly that Lady Arabella had done nothing so passive as bringing him anywhere, but rather had shown him through her own strength and self-possession what it meant to truly see another person, and that he was engaged in the humbling work of proving himself worthy of being seen by her in return, and his words silenced the gossips while making Arabella's heart contract with cautious hope. He wrote to her between their scheduled meetings, letters that bore no resemblance to the passionate declarations he had penned during her retreat to Derbyshire, but rather contained observations about his days, questions about her thoughts on matters both trivial and significant. And slowly, page by patient page, he built a foundation of genuine friendship beneath the romantic possibility that hovered between them like spring waiting beyond winter's grip. In March, when the first crocuses pushed through the soil in the London parks, Arabella realized that somewhere in the accumulated weeks of careful attention and genuine conversation, of being seen and heard and valued for precisely who she was, rather than who she might be convenient for him to marry, She had begun to trust not just his words but his transformation, and the fragile hope she had felt in November had grown into something more substantial, a belief that perhaps they might build together something neither could have created alone, a partnership born of hard-won understanding rather than easy attraction or convenient arrangement. The Duke proposed to Arabella on a soft April evening in the gardens of his family estate, where wisteria cascaded over ancient stone walls and the air carried the green scent of possibility, and he did not kneel with theatrical flourish before assembled witnesses, as he had done with Caroline, but rather took her hands in his as they walked alone through paths lined with early roses, and told her with quiet certainty that he had spent the past 5 months learning to see her completely, to understand the depths of her mind and the strength of her spirit and the gentle fierceness of her convictions, and that he could no longer imagine a future in which she was not his partner in every sense of the word, his intellectual equal and his heart's true companion, the woman who had taught him through her own hard-won self-possession what it meant to truly value another human soul. Arabella's acceptance came not with tearful gratitude as though he were conferring some great favor upon her, but rather with the calm certainty of a woman who knew her own worth and recognized in his proposal the meeting of two transformed souls. And when she said yes, she also told him that she expected their marriage to be a partnership of genuine equals, that she would not fade into the background of his life, but would continue to pursue her charitable work and her intellectual interests, and her own vision of what purpose meant, and he assured her that he desired nothing less than exactly that kind of marriage, that her strength and independence were precisely what he loved, rather than qualities to be diminished for the sake of convention. Their wedding took place in June, when London bloomed with summer's full promise, and Caroline stood as maid of honor, with a joy that held no trace of bitterness or regret, for she had found her own happiness with a gentleman whose quiet kindness matched her gentle nature far better than the Duke's intensity ever could have, and when she embraced Arabella before the ceremony, she whispered that she had known even in those early days, when she accepted the Duke's first proposal, that her dearest friend's heart belonged to him, and she was grateful that both of them had found the courage to claim the love they deserved, rather than settling for convenient arrangement. Lord Blackwood attended the wedding with surprising grace, standing among the guests with a melancholy smile that spoke of genuine happiness for Arabella's joy, even as it acknowledged his own loss, and when he congratulated the Duke afterward, there was no trace of their old enmity, but rather a mutual respect, born of having both been transformed by the same remarkable woman, and the Duke shook his hand with sincere gratitude for the role Blackwood had played in awakening them all to deeper truths about love and worthiness, and the courage required to choose authentically rather than conveniently. 3 years later, when the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth attended the height of the London season's opening ball, and those who remembered that earlier evening, when Lady Arabella Thornfield had stood invisible at the periphery, watching her best friend receive the Duke's proposal, could not help but marvel at the transformation, for the Duchess moved through the glittering ballroom with confident grace, her hand resting easily in her husband's arm, and the way he looked at her spoke of deep partnership and genuine devotion, of a man who had learned to truly see and was grateful every day for the gift of being seen in return by a woman who had discovered her own worth through the painful journey of claiming it. The years that followed brought transformations that rippled outward from that pivotal season when invisible hearts became visible and convenient arrangements gave way to chosen love, for the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth built together a partnership that became legendary in society, not for its romantic drama, but rather for its quiet depth and the way they worked side by side on the charitable causes she championed and the reforms he now pursued, with her vision guiding his influence. And those who watched them at gatherings saw how he still looked at her across crowded rooms with the wonder of a man who could not quite believe his fortune in being truly seen and chosen by such a woman, while she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had learned her own worth through the crucible of claiming it. Caroline flourished in her own marriage to the gentle gentleman whose kindness had always suited her nature far better than ducal grandeur ever could, and the friendship between the two women deepened into something richer than it had been when unspoken truths had created distance between them. For now they could speak honestly about their hearts and their choices, and support each other with the wisdom born of having both chosen authentically rather than conveniently. Even Lord Blackwood found his redemption through the strange alchemy of that transformative season, for having loved Arabella genuinely, if briefly had awakened in him a capacity for authentic feeling he had thought lost to cynicism, and he became known in later years not as the Duke's enemy, but rather as a trusted friend to them both, a man who had played his part in a larger story of transformation and had emerged from it better than he began. Dear listener, perhaps you recognize in this tale the truth that lives in all our stories, that we spend so much of our lives invisible to those around us and sometimes even to ourselves, playing roles we think we must perform while our authentic selves wait unacknowledged in the shadows of what we believe is expected. The danger of being unseen is not merely that others fail to recognize our worth, but that we begin to believe we have none, that we fade into our own peripheries and watch life unfold for others, while assuming our desires are too insignificant to voice or our dreams too foolish to pursue. Yet transformation becomes possible the moment we choose to be seen, even when being noticed brings scandal or disruption, or the uncomfortable dissolution of what was safe and familiar. For sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to remain invisible to ourselves, claiming space in our own stories rather than serving merely as scenery in the narratives of others. If you find yourself standing at the periphery watching others receive what your heart secretly desires, know that your story need not end in quiet resignation, that you have permission to step into the light of your own life and assert that your feelings matter and your worth exists independent of whether anyone has yet recognized it. The greatest love stories, the truest partnerships, the deepest joys are not found in convenient arrangements or safe choices, but rather in the terrifying, beautiful work of allowing ourselves to be fully seen and choosing those who have done the difficult work of learning to truly see us in return, not as reflections of their needs or convenient solutions to their problems, but as complete human souls deserving of genuine recognition and authentic love. May you find the courage to step out of the shadows of your own story. May you discover the strength to claim your worth even when no one else has named it. And may you rest tonight, knowing that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to choose being seen over remaining safe. This has been a tale from Wistful Narrator, and if it has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe and share it with someone who needs reminding that they deserve to be the protagonist of their own beautiful story, rather than merely the supporting character in someone else's convenient arrangement.